trillions of dollars. Secret wars. Hidden accounts that no citizen ever voted for. This is the untold story of the black budget, the invisible empire of money and power that has shaped our world from the shadows. Stay with us as we uncover what governments don't want you to know. And don't forget to subscribe to Zimo Voice for more documentaries that reveal the truths hidden behind closed doors. It is the world's most secretive organization, an invisible empire that moves in shadows, spends money no one can trace, and makes decisions that can change the fate of nations. It runs on a hidden stream of funds, a black budget, tucked away in obscure line items and shell companies, flowing offshore through front organizations. This is not just an agency. It is America's ultimate lever of global power, the Central Intelligence Agency. The story begins in the aftermath of the Second World War. It is 1945, and the world lies shattered. Europe is reduced to rubble, its cities smoking ruins, its people starving. The Pacific still burns under the light of atomic fire. But beyond the devastation, something else is stirring. A new world order is being born, and with it, a new kind of warfare. Across the continent, the Red Army of the Soviet Union occupies half of Europe. Stalin's grip tightens on capitals from Warsaw to Bucharest. Behind the Iron Curtain, secret police drag citizens into cellars. Paranoia replaces hope. For the United States, this is a nightmare. The war has been won, but a darker contest is beginning. A contest of ideology, espionage, and global survival. The United States government, for all its might, knows almost nothing of what the Soviets are planning. Washington is blind. At that time, the only American intelligence service is the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, a ragtag wartime agency that dropped agents behind Nazi lines, blew up supply depots, and smuggled weapons to resistance fighters. But the OSS was disbanded after victory. President Truman, inheriting the office after Roosevelt's death, at first believed America no longer needed spies. Peace, he thought, will allow the nation to turn inward to rebuild. But peace was an illusion. Moscow's intelligence network, the dreaded NKVD, was years ahead, ruthless, efficient, and already embedding itself across Europe, Asia, and even the Americas. Britain's MI6, though allied, kept secrets from Washington, mistrusting America's amateurs. The United States was winning battles with tanks and bombers, not with spies. Within months of the war's end, Truman realized his mistake. A new conflict was dawning, not with tanks, but with information, sabotage, and influence. America needed something it had never built before, a permanent peacetime intelligence service. In a sealed room in Washington, within the chambers of the newly formed National Security Council, a handful of men gathered. Behind closed doors, they laid the foundations of what would become the most powerful intelligence agency in history. They called it the Central Intelligence Agency. The National Security Act of 1947 gave birth to CIA, granting it a vague but powerful mandate to gather intelligence, conduct covert operations, and, if necessary, interfere in the affairs of other nations to protect U.S. interests. The language was intentionally broad. Perform such other functions and duties as the National Security Council may direct. That single phrase would become the gateway to everything. Coups, assassinations, propaganda, and wars in the shadows. But ambition required money. Covert wars and hidden armies could not be funded openly. Asking Congress would mean explaining operations that had to remain secret. The solution was ingenious and deeply troubling. As Europe starved in the late 1940s, the United States launched a Marshall Plan, a massive relief effort to rebuild shattered economies. Officially, over $13 billion was poured into Europe, food, fuel, factories, and roads. But hidden within the fine print was a secret. 5% of that money, nearly $685 million, was quietly diverted into CIA accounts. This became the first great black budget. With it, the CIA bribed politicians, funded friendly labor unions, shaped media narratives, and rigged elections across Western Europe. It was a silent army fueled by American dollars. Yet money did not guarantee success. The CIA was young, inexperienced, and clumsy. Its early operations in Soviet territory ended in disaster, betrayed by double agents and crushed by the ruthless efficiency of the KGB. Entire networks of CIA-trained agents were wiped out. Internal reports admitted the agency had been fatally penetrated. By the early 1950s, the CIA's reputation was so poor that even allies mocked its failures. The agency needed redemption. It came in 1953, in the deserts of Iran. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized Iran's oil, stripping Britain of its lucrative control. Desperate, London turned to Washington. The CIA approved a plan called Operation Ajax, led by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of a U.S. president. With $1 million in hand, Roosevelt bribed politicians, spread propaganda, and stirred mobs in Tehran. Within days, tanks rolled, Mossadegh was ousted and the Shah restored. For the CIA, it was a triumphant debut. A democracy had been toppled, oil secured, and Langley hailed it as a model for future coups. But the precedent was dangerous. What began in Iran would be repeated in Guatemala, Chile, Congo, and beyond. The CIA was now not only gathering intelligence, it was shaping the governments of nations. The taste of victory in Iran was intoxicating. For the CIA, Operation Ajax was proof that with money, propaganda, and covert influence, an entire government could be bent to America's will. It was cheaper than war, quieter than diplomacy, and more effective than sanctions. In Langley's hidden offices, a lesson was etched in stone. Regime change would be bought. Almost immediately, Washington looked elsewhere. In 1954, the focus shifted to Central America, where a tiny country was about to become the next testing ground. Guatemala. The nation was ruled by President Jacobo Arbenz, a left-leaning reformer who dared to challenge the economic stranglehold of the United Fruit Company, an American corporation that controlled vast banana plantations, railroads, and ports. Arbenz introduced land reforms to give peasants a share of the country's wealth, seizing and used land from United Fruit. To Washington, the smell of communism. And for the company's executives who had close friends in the Eisenhower administration, it was intolerable. The CIA launched Operation Success. Again, millions of dollars flowed quietly from the black budget. The agency recruited mercenaries, armed exiles, and spread propaganda through radio stations broadcasting fake reports of mass uprisings. CIA pilots bombed Guatemalan cities, while psychological operations created an illusion of chaos. In June 1954, Arbenz resigned and fled into exile. Another democracy had been extinguished, replaced by a military junta friendly to Washington. What followed was a nightmare. Guatemala spiraled into decades of civil war, with death squads murdering thousands, villages razed, and entire communities living in terror. For the CIA, it was another success. For Guatemala, it was the beginning of an endless tragedy. The world had changed. A new Cold War battlefield had opened, not in Europe, but in the developing world. And the CIA's role was expanding far beyond intelligence. It was now an architect of governments, an invisible empire builder. By the mid-1950s, the CIA's black budget had grown dramatically. Congress approved lump sums for national security without asking too many questions. Within those funds, hidden line items, shell companies, and offshore accounts concealed the agency's true spending. Billions of taxpayer dollars were vanishing into the shadows. Covert operations, slush funds for bribery, secret airlines, armed shipments, even assassination plots, all hidden behind the phrase classified expenditures. The agency had another weapon besides money: technology. In 1956, the CIA launched a U-2 spy plane capable of flying 70,000 feet above Soviet territory, photographing military bases and missile sites. Built in secrecy, funded by black budget dollars. The U-2 gave Washington eyes it had never possessed before, but it also risked nuclear war, as seen in 1960 when pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union, sparking an international crisis. Still, the CIA's appetite for covert action grew. In Congo, 1960, when nationalist leader Patrice Lumumba threatened to align with the Soviet Union, the CIA marked him for elimination. Funds were allocated for bribes, for mercenary armies, and, most chillingly, for poison. Documents declassified decades later revealed the agency even sent toxins meant to be slipped into Lumumba's toothpaste. Though that plot failed, Lumumba was eventually captured, executed, and replaced by the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko, a man who would rule with iron and corruption for decades, supported by U.S. dollars. In Indonesia, 1957 to 1958, the CIA armed and trained rebel forces to overthrow President Sukarno, a nationalist who refused to fully align with Washington. The operation ended in embarrassment when a CIA pilot, Alan Pope, was shot down and captured alive, exposing America's role. Yet the lesson was not to stop, but to get smarter. And then came Cuba. Just 90 miles from Florida, Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959 sent shockwaves through Washington. The CIA scrambled to contain him. They funded exile groups, launched sabotage campaigns, and even drew up bizarre assassination plots, exploding cigars, poisoned wetsuits, and mafia contracts to kill Castro. The black budget was now financing not just coups, but what often looked like dark comedy. The climax came in 1961 with the Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA recruited and trained 1,400 Cuban exiles, armed them, and sent them to storm Castro's beaches. The plan was meant to spark a popular uprising. Instead, it was a disaster. Castro's forces crushed the invaders within 3 days. The humiliation was global, and President John F. Kennedy was furious. But Kennedy did not dismantle the CIA. Instead, he tightened his grip, ordering new secret programs, from plots to kill Castro to massive covert operations in Vietnam. The agency had failed spectacularly, but its budget only grew. By the mid-1960s, the CIA had become a state within a state. It controlled its own airlines, such as Air America, used to ferry arms and opium through Southeast Asia. It funded universities and cultural organizations to spread pro-American ideology. It even infiltrated Hollywood, encouraging films that painted the United States as heroic and the Soviets as villains. The black budget was limitless, and oversight was minimal. Very few in Congress knew how much was being spent or where. The money flowed like a river, secret, silent, untraceable. And behind the numbers were people, assassins, informants, coup plotters, exiles, and agents who operated in the gray zone between diplomacy and war. For the CIA, the world was not divided into peace and conflict. The entire world was a battlefield, every government potential target, every leader either an ally to be bought or an enemy to be overthrown. The invisible empire was expanding. The disaster in Cuba was a turning point. The Bay of Pigs had embarrassed the White House and shattered the illusion of the CIA's infallibility. Yet instead of clipping its wings, Washington doubled down. The Cold War was escalating, and the CIA remained America's invisible spear. In Southeast Asia, a small country was becoming the center of global tension, Vietnam. The CIA had been active in Indochina since the 1950s, long before American combat troops arrived. Through its airline, Air America, it funneled weapons, money, and supplies into jungles and mountains. Air America's planes were painted in civilian colors, but inside their cargo bays were crates of rifles, radios, and, in some cases, heroin. For decades, rumors persisted that the CIA turned a blind eye to the opium trade, using it to fund anti-communist militias in Laos and Vietnam. The CIA's mission in Vietnam was not simply intelligence gathering, it was counterinsurgency. In 1965, the agency created the Phoenix Program, a secret campaign designed to dismantle the Viet Cong by any means necessary. Suspected sympathizers were captured, interrogated, tortured, and executed. Thousands of innocent civilians were swept up in the dragnet. Officially, Phoenix was about neutralizing enemy infrastructure. In reality, it became a campaign of terror that scarred entire villages. The war in Vietnam was bleeding America, and the CIA's hidden war in Laos made matters worse. With no congressional approval and no public debate, the agency built an entire secret army of Hmong tribesmen, training them to fight and die in battles the American people never knew existed. This invisible war, funded by black budgets, claimed tens of thousands of lives and left Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Even as Vietnam burned, the CIA's reach stretched further. In Chile, 1973, the people had elected Salvador Allende, a Marxist who promised to nationalize industries and redistribute wealth. To Washington, this was unacceptable. The CIA, under orders from President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, launched a campaign of sabotage. Money flowed into strikes, propaganda campaigns, and bribes to the military. On September 11, 1973, tanks rolled through Santiago and Allende was dead. In his place stood General Augusto Pinochet, a brutal dictator whose regime tortured thousands. The CIA called it a victory for freedom. For Chile, it was the beginning of a nightmare. But coups and wars were only part of the story. The CIA also turned inward, experimenting with control over the human mind itself. This was MKUltra. In secret labs, funded by the black budget, scientists tested LSD, hypnosis, electroshock, and sensory deprivation. The goal: to break the human will, to create perfect spies, to reprogram thought. Victims, often unaware volunteers, psychiatric patients, or prisoners, were subjected to horrific experiments. Some were driven insane. Others never returned. When the program was exposed in the 1970s, the CIA destroyed most of the records, erasing evidence of how far they had gone. But fragments remained, enough to reveal a chilling truth. America's secret empire had tried to weaponize the human mind. By now, the CIA had grown arrogant, confident that operated above the law, but shadows began to creep into the light. In 1972, two reporters at the Washington Post uncovered the Watergate scandal, exposing a White House campaign of burglary and sabotage tied to Nixon's re-election. Among the shadows of Watergate were CIA operatives, former officers who had carried their tradecraft from covert coups to American soil. The scandal shook the nation and forced Nixon to resign. But the real earthquake came in 1975. The Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church, pulled back the curtain on decades of CIA activities. Televised hearings revealed assassination plots against foreign leaders, domestic spying on American citizens, mind control experiments, and coups orchestrated without congressional approval. For the first time, the public glimpsed the true scale of the black budget empire. The revelations shocked Americans. The agency was forced to roll back some of its most extreme practices. New oversight committees were created in Congress, but these reforms were only partial. The CIA adapted, learned to hide deeper, to move money through even more complex channels. By the late 1970s, as the scars of Vietnam faded, the agency was already preparing for its next great battlefield. In the deserts of the Middle East and the mountains of Afghanistan, a new war was brewing. The scars of Vietnam had humbled America, but they did not end the shadow wars. If anything, the defeat in Southeast Asia hardened Washington's resolve to fight communism in new ways, indirectly, quietly, and often illegally. The CIA was the perfect weapon. By 1979, the world shifted again. In Iran, a revolution toppled the Shah, the very monarch the CIA had helped restore in 1953. Crowds stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, seizing 52 American hostages. For Washington, it was humiliation on live television. The agency that once controlled Iran now watched helplessly as Islamic revolutionaries burned its networks to the ground. But while one door closed, another opened in Afghanistan. That same year, Soviet tanks rolled across the border, beginning a decade-long occupation. For the CIA, this was a gift. Here was a chance to bleed the Soviet Union in its own version of Vietnam. Under President Carter and later Ronald Reagan, the CIA funneled billions in weapons, cash, and training to Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen. It was called Operation Cyclone, and it became one of the most expensive covert wars in history. Using the black budget, the CIA purchased rifles, rocket launchers, and eventually Stinger missiles capable of downing Soviet helicopters. Arms were funneled through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, and into the mountains of Afghanistan. The warlords who received them would later become infamous. Men like Gabbuddin Hekmatyar, and even a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. In Washington, the war was celebrated as a triumph of covert power. By the late 1980s, the Soviets were retreating, battered, and demoralized. But the victory carried seeds of future disaster. The networks built by the CIA, the flow of weapons, and the radical fighters hardened by war, all of it would outlive the Cold War. turning its fire on the West itself. Yet, Afghanistan was only one theater. The 1980s also saw the CIA plunge deep into Central America. In Nicaragua, a leftist revolution had toppled the Somoza dictatorship, bringing the Sandinista government to power. To the Reagan administration, this was another communist foothold in America's backyard. The CIA responded by creating a proxy army. The Contras, through black budget funds, the agency trained, armed, and supported thousands of Contras, despite widespread reports of atrocities, assassinations, kidnappings, and massacres of civilians. When Congress tried to cut off funding, the CIA turned to secret channels, using arms sales to Iran to covertly bankroll the war. This became the Iran-Contra affair. The scheme was staggering in its audacity. On one side, the U.S. sold weapons to Iran, America's sworn enemy, in exchange for hostages. On the other, the profits were funneled into the Contras, bypassing Congress entirely. When the scandal broke in 1986, it exposed just how far the CIA's black budget operations had strayed from oversight. A hidden empire was writing its own rules, conducting foreign policy in total secrecy. Meanwhile, in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the CIA funneled millions into right-wing governments and death squads fighting leftist insurgents. Villages were burned, peasants slaughtered, and tens of thousands disappeared into shallow graves. Officially, it was about stopping communism. In reality, it was about control, and it was paid for with untraceable dollars. The black budget was no longer a slush fund. It was an empire of its own. By the mid-1980s, estimates suggest the CIA had access to billions annually, hidden behind innocuous Pentagon contracts, shell companies, and classified programs. Even Congress could not follow the trail. The money vanished into front airlines, offshore accounts, and intelligence cutouts. And with money came technology. In the 1980s, the CIA pioneered satellite surveillance, advanced spy planes, and early digital networks. Funds were poured into stealth technology, cyber research, and experimental weapons, all under the cover of national security. Every year, the classified annex of the defense budget grew thicker, filled with numbers no ordinary citizen would ever see. But perhaps the most chilling development was the CIA's deepening relationship with the world of organized crime and banking. Investigations later revealed connections between the CIA and the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, a global financial institution that laundered money for dictators, drug cartels, and terrorists, all while serving as a slush fund for covert operations. Billions moved through BCCI accounts, financing wars and coups without leaving fingerprints. When the bank collapsed in the early 1990s, the scale of the corruption stunned the world. But by then, the CIA had already moved on. The 1980s cemented the CIA's role as not just an intelligence service, but global financial and political empire. It could topple governments, arm secret armies, and move billions with no oversight. The black budget was no longer hidden on the margins. It had become the bloodstream of America's shadow wars. Yet for all its triumphs, the empire was fragile. Shadows cannot remain hidden forever. By the dawn of the 1990s, revelations and scandals threatened to expose just how deeply the CIA's black budget had reshaped the world. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the end of an era. The Cold War, the decades-long struggle that had defined the CIA's very existence, was over. In Moscow, the Soviet Union crumbled, its once mighty empire dissolving into fragments. For the first time since 1947, America no longer faced a rival superpower. But for the CIA, this posed a problem. An agency built on the justification of fighting communism now had to prove its worth in a world where the enemy had vanished. Critics in Congress called for budget cuts. Some whispered that the CIA itself was obsolete. Yet inside Langley, officials knew the truth. The black budget would survive. The enemy might change names, but the shadow wars would continue. And so they did. In the early 1990s, the agency turned its attention to the drug trade. With communism collapsing, Washington declared a new war, the war on drugs. Once again, billions were funneled into covert operations. The CIA built ties with cartels, traffickers, and foreign military units. In Colombia, It backed operations against Pablo Escobar, even as reports emerged of the agency looking the other way while allied groups smuggled cocaine into the United States. In Mexico, CIA-trained units were implicated in massacres. The war was less about eradicating drugs and more about controlling who profited from them. At the same time, the CIA expanded its global surveillance network. The black budget funded new satellites, early computer systems, and data collection tools. By the mid-1990s, programs were intercepting phone calls, faxes, and emails on a massive scale. This was the quiet birth of the digital surveillance state. But nothing tested the CIA like the Middle East. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, triggering the Gulf War. As American troops prepared for combat, the CIA's black budget poured into reconnaissance, secret operations, and high-tech weaponry. The war itself was short, but it reshaped the region, and it cemented oil-rich territories as the new focus of America's covert empire. The collapse of the Soviet Union also created a dangerous vacuum. In the shattered states of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, nuclear weapons scientists and technology were suddenly vulnerable. Billions in black budget funds were quietly spent securing and sometimes smuggling nuclear material. Some operations succeeded. Others vanished into corruption, with weapons-grade uranium and plutonium slipping into the black market. Meanwhile, the agency faced new enemies, ones it had ironically helped create. In Afghanistan, the Mujahideen fighters trained and armed by the CIA in the 1980s had morphed into something darker. Networks of radical militants, flush with weapons and ideology, began to see America not as an ally, but as the ultimate enemy. Out of these battle-hardened groups, one organization would rise to prominence: Al-Qaeda. Through the 1990s, Al-Qaeda struck at U.S. interests abroad, bombing embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, killing hundreds. Each attack revealed gaps in America's defenses. Yet even as the CIA hunted Osama bin Laden, its networks were stretched thin, its failures piling up. The black budget grew, but oversight and coordination lagged behind. At home, another scandal rocked the agency. Investigative journalists exposed ties between the CIA and drug trafficking during the 1980s Contra War. Articles suggested the agency had knowingly allowed cocaine to flow into U.S. cities, fueling the crack epidemic, in order to fund covert operations. The revelations ignited outrage, particularly in African-American communities ravaged by drugs and crime. Though official reports later denied direct complicity, the suspicion lingered. The CIA was seen as an organization that would do anything, sacrifice anyone, for its hidden wars. As the decade closed, a darker storm was brewing. On one side, the agency had unprecedented surveillance tools, secret funds, and global reach. On the other, a stateless enemy was plotting in caves and safe houses, preparing a strike that would shatter America's sense of security. The black budget empire was about to face its greatest test yet, and it would come not in the jungles of Vietnam, the deserts of Iraq, or the mountains of Afghanistan, but in the heart of New York City. The morning of September 11th, 2001, began like any other, but by the end of the day, the United States was transformed. 19 hijackers turned passenger jets into weapons, striking the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost, and the illusion of American invincibility was shattered in a single morning. For the CIA, the attacks were a humiliation. Al-Qaeda, the very network born out of America's covert war in Afghanistan, had struck at the heart of the nation. Intelligence warnings had been missed. Rivalries between agencies had blinded decision-makers. And the black budget empire, with all its billions, had failed to prevent the most devastating attack on U.S. soil. But in crisis came opportunity. Overnight, the CIA's budget exploded. Billions poured into counterterrorism, surveillance, covert operations, and new technologies. The agency was reborn not as a Cold War relic, but as the spearhead of the war on terror. Within weeks, the CIA was on the ground in Afghanistan. Small teams of operatives, armed with suitcases of cash and satellite radios, linked up with the Northern Alliance, a coalition of Afghan warlords opposed to the Taliban. Using black budget funds, The CIA bought loyalty, paid militias, and coordinated airstrikes that toppled the Taliban in a matter of weeks. For a brief moment, the agency basked in glory, hailed as America's silent saviors. But the war did not end. Instead, it metastasized. As the hunt for Osama bin Laden dragged on, the CIA expanded into new and darker territory. Across the globe, secret prisons, black sites, were established in countries from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia. Here, detainees were subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques, waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation. To its critics, this was torture funded by the black budget. To the CIA, it was a necessary evil in the fight against terror. At the same time, a massive surveillance machine was constructed. Programs like Stellarwind began collecting phone records, internet traffic, and emails on a scale never seen before. The CIA, alongside the NSA, was turning the digital revolution into a weapon of control. For ordinary citizens, privacy quietly evaporated, replaced by databases and algorithms. Then came Iraq. In 2003, the Bush administration claimed Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Much of this intelligence flowed through CIA channels. Later, it would be revealed that the evidence was weak, manipulated, or outright false. But by then, the war had begun. Billions more in black budget dollars were unleashed to topple Baghdad. The CIA's role was vast, infiltrating networks, bribing officials, coordinating special forces, and directing covert missions in the chaos that followed. As Iraq descended into sectarian war, the agency pivoted again. In the deserts of Waziristan, the mountains of Yemen, and the plains of Somalia, a new weapon emerged: the drone. The Predator drone, once a surveillance tool, was fitted with Hellfire missiles. Suddenly, the CIA had the power to kill targets anywhere in the world with a click of a button. The drone program became the centerpiece of the agency's new black budget war. Thousands of suspected militants and civilians were killed in strikes that required no trial, no oversight, and no accountability. To supporters, drones were a clean, surgical weapon. To critics, they were execution machines, spreading terror in villages and breeding more enemies than they eliminated. Yet the drone fleets grew, funded by billions in secret appropriations. The war on terror stretched into every corner of the globe. In Pakistan, billions in black budget aid flowed to the military and intelligence services, even as elements of those same services sheltered Taliban fighters. In Africa, CIA bases sprang up in the Sahel and Horn, launching surveillance flights and special missions. In Europe, secret rendition flights transported prisoners to black sites, far from the reach of law. By the late 2000s, the CIA had become more powerful than ever in its history. Its budget had doubled, then tripled, hidden deep within Pentagon accounts. Its arsenal included satellites, drones, cyber weapons, and armies of contractors. Its reach extended from Guantanamo Bay to the caves of Tora Bora. But behind the triumphs were failures. The war in Iraq spiraled out of control. Afghanistan, once won, was again collapsing into insurgency, and Osama bin Laden remained at large, mocking the agency that had once armed him. The black budget empire had survived the end of the Cold War. It had survived scandal after scandal. And now, in the war on terror, it had reinvented itself, not just as an intelligence service, but as a global war machine. But as the first decade of the 21st century ended, questions grew louder. Could this secret empire truly keep America safe? Or had it created a cycle of endless war, where the shadows themselves became the enemy? The dawn of the 2010s brought with it both triumphs and reckoning for the CIA. The war on terror was nearly a decade old, and America was weary of endless wars. Yet the agency's black budget empire was more entrenched than ever. Then, in May 2011, came a moment of vindication. For years, Osama bin Laden had eluded capture, hiding in plain sight in Pakistan. After painstaking surveillance, informants, and a web of intelligence, the CIA tracked him to a compound in Abbottabad. On May 2nd, Navy SEALs stormed the compound under the cover of darkness. Bin Laden was killed. For Washington, it was a victory, a symbol that justice had been delivered. For the CIA, it was redemption after the humiliation of 9/11. Billions in black budget spending had finally paid off in a single night, but the triumph masked deeper problems. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan dragged on, consuming lives and treasure. Insurgencies seemed endless. The very tools the CIA had pioneered, covert funding, arming rebels, drone strikes, were now creating unintended consequences. Every victory seemed to sow the seeds of the next conflict. The same year bin Laden was killed, another event shook the shadows: the rise of the whistleblower. In 2013, former NSA contractor Edward Snowden leaked thousands of documents revealing the vast-scale surveillance carried out under the War on Terror. The CIA's programs, alongside the NSA's, were suddenly exposed. Americans learned their phone calls, emails, and online activity had been swept into massive government databases. Allies discovered they, too, had been spied upon. The revelations ignited global outrage and sparked debates about privacy, freedom, and the cost of security. For the first time, the black budget's reach into everyday life was undeniable. Meanwhile, new threats emerged. In 2014, the collapse of Iraq's fragile government gave rise to a brutal new enemy, ISIS. With lightning speed, the Islamic State seized vast territories in Iraq and Syria, declaring a caliphate. Once again, the CIA was drawn into secret wars, training rebels in Syria, launching drone strikes across the region, and funneling billions into proxy forces. But as in past decades, these covert efforts were messy. Some of the groups trained by the CIA defected, joining extremists. Others turned their weapons on allies. The cycle of unintended consequences continued. Beyond the Middle East, the battlefield expanded into cyberspace. The 2010s saw the CIA and its partners wage invisible wars across computer networks. Cyber operations targeted terrorist groups, rival states, and sometimes allies. Leaks later revealed that the CIA had developed entire arsenals of digital weapons, malware, backdoors, and hacking tools capable of infiltrating phones, computers, even smart TVs. The battlefield was no longer just jungles, deserts, or city streets. It was inside the devices people carried in their pockets. But just as the CIA adapted, so too did its enemies. Russia, once a declining power, re-emerged with aggressive cyber campaigns, spreading disinformation, hacking networks, and meddling elections. China expanded its cyber and surveillance capabilities, challenging U.S. dominance in technology. The CIA found itself in a new kind of Cold War, one fought with data instead of tanks. Amid all this, drone warfare became the face of the black budget. Thousands of strikes were carried out in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and beyond. For the public, drones represented precision and safety. But for those on the ground, they were a source of terror, buzzing overhead without warning, capable of striking homes, weddings, and villages. Human rights groups documented civilian casualties, raising questions about the legality and morality of a secret assassination program run by intelligence officers. The 2010s were also an era of leaks. From WikiLeaks publishing CIA documents to the infamous Vault 7 leak in 2017, the agency's secrets spilled into the public domain. These leaks exposed not only tools of cyber warfare, but also the fragility of the agency itself. The shadows were never entirely secure. By the end of the decade, the CIA faced a paradox. It had more money, technology, and global reach than ever before. Its drones circled the skies, its algorithms scanned oceans of data, and its operatives influenced wars from Syria to Africa. And yet its failures, endless conflicts, radicalization, blowback, were plain to see. The black budget empire was alive, powerful, and still expanding. But it was also under scrutiny. The question loomed larger than ever. Had America's invisible government truly made the world safer, or had it built a machine that perpetuated war without end? The 2020s began not with war, but with a virus. When COVID-19 swept across the globe in early 2020, intelligence agencies, including the CIA, scrambled to understand its origins, its impact, and the chaos it would unleash. Questions about whether the virus emerged naturally or from a lab in Wuhan sparked fierce debate. The CIA poured black budget funds into tracking the spread, analyzing genetic data, and monitoring governments' responses. For many, the pandemic revealed something unsettling. In an interconnected world, invisible threats could be just as destabilizing as bombs or bullets. At the same time, geopolitical tensions escalated. The new Cold War was no longer with the Soviet Union, but with China. China's rapid rise as a technological and economic power posed the greatest challenge to U.S. dominance since World War II. The CIA shifted billions in resources toward monitoring Beijing, its military buildup, its surveillance state, its global infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. Cyber espionage intensified on both sides. American officials accused China of hacking sensitive databases, stealing corporate secrets, and expanding its influence in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. The CIA, in turn, ramped up its own operations, targeting Chinese companies, monitoring supply chains, and funding countermeasures in allied nations. Meanwhile, Russia roared back into global focus. In February 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine, igniting the largest war in Europe since 1945. The CIA's role, hidden behind headlines, was vast. Billions in black budget funds were funneled into intelligence sharing, covert training, and advanced weaponry for Ukraine. Satellites and surveillance aircraft fed real-time battlefield data. Cyber operations disrupted Russian command systems. Once again, the CIA was waging a shadow war, not with its own soldiers, but through proxies, money, and technology. Yet while Russia dominated headlines, another battlefield emerged: cyberspace and AI. By the mid-2020s, artificial intelligence had become both a tool and a weapon. Intelligence agencies invested heavily in algorithms capable of analyzing mountains of intercepted communications, predicting political unrest, and even generating disinformation. Deepfake technology blurred the line between truth and fabrication. Propaganda no longer needed printing presses or radio stations. It could spread across social media in seconds, crafted by machines and amplified by bots. The CIA and its rivals poured resources into this digital arms race, knowing that in the modern world, controlling perception was as powerful as controlling territory. Drones, too, evolved. No longer limited to massive predators and reapers, smaller AI-driven drones capable of swarming targets appeared on the battlefield. These new systems blurred the line between intelligence and warfare, between surveillance and assassination. Black budget research projects funded prototypes that remained far from public view, invisible weapons for invisible wars. But while technology advanced, old questions resurfaced. Critics argued that decades of secret wars had created blowback, fueling instability rather than stability. The collapse of Afghanistan in 2021, after 20 years of covert and overt U.S. presence, raised hard questions. How could trillions of dollars and billions in CIA funding fail to build a sustainable state? The Taliban's swift return to power was a stark reminder of the limits of shadow empires. At home, debates over privacy and oversight intensified. Revelations of mass surveillance in the 2010s had not ended the programs. They had only pushed them deeper underground. By the 2020s, facial recognition, biometric tracking, and AI surveillance had spread across airports, city streets, and even online classrooms. Much of this infrastructure had roots in black budget programs, now adopted by civilian governments. The CIA's fingerprints were everywhere, even in the devices people use daily. Today, the black budget remains one of the U.S. government's deepest secrets. Estimates suggest it exceeds $80 billion a year, hidden within military accounts, spread across hundreds of programs, and funneled through contractors that the public will never know. It pays for satellites orbiting silently overhead, drones circling battlefields, spies in foreign capitals, and digital armies of hackers waging invisible wars. From the deserts of the Middle East to the streets of Kiev, from the skies of Taiwan to the servers of Silicon Valley, the CIA's hidden empire continues to shape the modern world. And yet, its greatest strength remains its greatest danger: secrecy. For as long as black budgets remain in the shadows, unchecked and unaccountable, the same questions will haunt every generation. Who really controls the empire's secrets? And at what cost? From its birth in 1947, the CIA was never just an intelligence agency. It was a tool of empire, forged in the fires of the Cold War, fueled by secrecy and empowered by money no one could trace. What began as a small office in Langley became a global force, toppling governments, shaping wars, and rewriting the destinies of nations. In the 1950s, the black budget overthrew leaders in Iran and Guatemala, carving invisible scars across continents. In the 1960s, it waged secret wars in Laos and Vietnam, built assassination programs, and experimented with the human mind itself. The 1970s exposed fragments of this hidden world to the Church Committee, yet the shadows never disappeared. They simply adapted. By the 1980s, the black budget had matured into a vast empire, funding proxy wars in Afghanistan and Central America, fueling scandals like Iran-Contra, and laundering billions through shadow banks. The Cold War was its justification, but its methods were eternal. Bribes, coups, assassinations, and covert armies built from the dirt of forgotten battlefields. The 1990s were no retreat. With the Soviet Union gone, the agency reinvented itself, turning its gaze to drug wars, cyber espionage, and the rising specter of terrorism. When 9/11 struck, the black budget swelled into a monster. Billions flowed into Afghanistan, Iraq, drones, secret prisons, and digital surveillance, transforming the agency into a global war machine. The 2010s brought triumphs, like the killing of Osama bin Laden, but also humiliations. Snowden's leaks, endless drone wars, and the rise of ISIS. The shadows were vast, but never invulnerable. The empire's power leaked in fragments, giving the public fleeting glimpses of what had been built in their name, but without their knowledge. And now, in the 2020s, the story continues. Black budgets fund satellites that see every corner of the earth, drones that hover unseen above villages, and algorithms that sift through oceans of data. Artificial intelligence and cyber warfare are the new weapons of control. Great power rivalry with China, proxy wars with Russia, and covert games in Africa and the Middle East keep the machine alive. The sums spent remain hidden, buried in Pentagon line items, invisible to taxpayers whose money sustains the empire. And yet, what has it achieved? The CIA has toppled governments, but often replaced them with dictatorships. It has fought terrorism, but in many cases created the conditions for more violence. It has built a surveillance state so vast that privacy itself has become a relic of the past. For every secret victory, there are hidden tragedies, unseen graves, and consequences that ripple for generations. The black budget empire is not just about secrecy. It is about power, unaccountable, unrestrained, and unseen. Democracies are supposed to operate in the light. Yet for decades, an invisible government has operated in the shadows, shaping history without consent, leaving ordinary people in the dark. As we look back on this hidden history, one truth emerges. Secrecy breeds power, and power breeds corruption. The black budget may protect nations, but also erodes them from within. It makes governments less accountable, wars more endless, and the line between safety and tyranny harder to see. And so, the story is not over. It will never be over. Because as long as nations fear enemies, as long as power can be hidden behind classified files, the black budget will grow. The real question is not whether it exists, but who it serves. Does it protect the people, or does it protect itself? For in the end, the greatest threat to democracy may not be an enemy abroad, but the empire of secrets that grows within. So we leave you with this. The black budget began in the shadows, and it thrives there still. But shadows can only survive if we choose not to look. If you followed this journey, from coups and wars to drones and cyber weapons, then the story is now yours to tell. Backhand index pointing right. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the black budget keeps us safe, or does it endanger freedom itself? And don't forget to subscribe to Zimo Voice, where we uncover the truths hidden in the shadows. Because the deeper we look, the more we realize history isn't just written in the light, it's whispered in the dark. But to truly understand the CIA's black budget, we have to step back, step away from the operations, the scandals, the wars, and the numbers, and ask, what does it mean for the world? The United States was founded on ideals of liberty, transparency, and accountability. Leaders swore that government would serve the people. And yet, hidden behind those promises, a second government was created, one that requires no permission, one that thrives on secrecy, one that does not answer to the people who fund it. Think of it this way. When a taxpayer in Kansas or Karachi pays for bread, fuel, or school, Some fraction of that money, invisible on the receipt, ends up in a labyrinth of black budgets, classified programs, and covert wars. It is money that buys drones, bribes generals, and manipulates elections. The ordinary citizen lives in the daylight, but their money works in the dark, and the dark is patient. Every decade, the black budget adapts. In the Cold War, it was nuclear weapons and coups. In the 1980s, it was proxy wars and cocaine-funded rebels. In the 2000s, it became drones, satellites, and torture sites scattered across the globe. In the 2020s, it is artificial intelligence, cyber weapons, quantum computing, and biological research. The shape changes, but the essence is the same: power without oversight. Here lies the paradox. Nations claim to be transparent democracies, but they survive by behaving like empires of secrecy. Citizens demand security, but the methods of achieving it are hidden from them. And so, fear becomes a justification. Terrorism, communism, extremism, foreign threats, all fuel the machinery of secrecy. The more fear grows, the more shadows expand. But shadows always come with costs. The cost is trust. When citizens discover pieces of the truth, like in culture's mind control experiments, or drone strikes that kill civilians, or mass surveillance revealed by Snowden, trust erodes. And when trust collapses, democracy itself weakens. The cost is freedom. Surveillance once targeted enemies. Now it records citizens' calls, messages, locations, and habits. A system designed for war has been turned inward, watching the very people it was meant to protect. And the cost is accountability. The CIA and the Pentagon spend billions, but who truly knows where the money goes? Politicians sign off on budgets without reading them. Oversight committees receive redacted documents. The truth is scattered into fragments no one can piece together. History shows us something chilling. Empires rarely fall from enemies outside. They rot from within, from corruption, secrecy, and arrogance. Rome, Spain, Britain, all fell when their shadows grew too heavy. So what does this mean for America and for the world? It means the black budget is not just about America. It is about global power. When the CIA moves money in the shadows, it ripples everywhere. Coups in Africa, wars in Asia, regimes in Latin America, all become part of the same hidden story. Nations that resist are isolated. Leaders who oppose are replaced. The empire of secrecy is not bound by borders. And perhaps most dangerously, it inspires others. Russia builds its own covert networks. China invests in cyber armies and surveillance grids. Even smaller states mimic these methods, turning secrecy into the new language of power. The black budget is not just an American invention anymore. It is a blueprint for a hidden world order. But here's the irony. The more power grows in the shadows, the more fragile it becomes. Secrets are heavy. They demand loyalty, silence, and lies. They demand cover-ups. And history teaches us that secrets always surface. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, truth cuts through. The question is, when the truth fully comes out, will it be too late? Will we discover that the very system designed to protect freedom has already destroyed it? This is the haunting legacy of the black budget. It is not only a financial empire, it is a moral test. A test of whether societies can govern in the light, or whether they will forever be ruled by shadows. And as you listen to this story, remember, this is not just history. It is the present. It is the future. The next war, the next global crisis, the next shift in technology, all of it will be shaped not by the budgets we see, but by the ones we never do. The world we live in today, from smartphones to surveillance, from wars to elections, has already been shaped by invisible hands. And those hands are still moving. So ask yourself, who holds power in your world? Is it the leaders you see on TV? Or is it the hidden architects of empire, the ones you never see at all? Because in the end, democracy lives or dies not just in parliaments, not just in elections, but in the shadows where money flows unseen. And if we choose not to look, we choose not to know. This is not just America's story. This is humanity's story. And it is still being written. But perhaps the most unsettling truth about the black budget is this. It thrives because we allow it to. Citizens, often overwhelmed by daily struggles, bills, jobs, family survival, rarely stop to ask, where does our money go? And governments, aware of this distraction, bury the truth deeper. In a sense, the black budget survives not only because of secrecy, but also because of silence. Silence from the people, silence from the press, silence that becomes complicity. And yet, the black budget is not just about numbers or operations. It is about shaping reality itself. Think about this. Every piece of history you know, every war, every crisis, every peace treaty, has an official version, a story told in schools, in newspapers, in speeches. But behind that version is another layer. Hidden funding, secret missions, covert alliances. The black budget writes history in invisible ink. What you see on the page is only half the story. Consider the Cold War. We are taught it was a battle of ideology, capitalism versus communism. But in truth, it was also a battle of shadows. Billions in hidden funds fueled coups in Iran, assassinations in Africa, propaganda in Europe. Nations didn't just collapse from ideology. They collapsed from covert operations funded by money no citizen ever voted for. Consider the War on Terror. Officially, it was about fighting extremists. But secretly, billions flowed into surveillance programs, private contractors, and secret prisons. An entire generation grew up under the eye of machines. Drones above, cameras around, algorithms watching. And all of it, hidden inside budgets no one ever read. What does this mean for us today? It means we live in two worlds. The visible one, where leaders speak of democracy, development, and progress. And the invisible one, where decisions are made in secret rooms, funded by hidden money, shaping the visible world without accountability. This duality raises a haunting question. Are we truly free, or are we living inside a story written by unseen hands? And yet, secrecy is not eternal. History shows us cracks always appear. Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, the Snowden files, these moments ripped open the veil. Each time, the public gasped. Each time, trust in government collapsed further. The black budget may seem indestructible, but in truth it is fragile because it depends on secrecy, and secrecy depends on silence. A single leak, a single whistleblower, a single collapse of trust can shatter decades of hidden power. This is why the story of the black budget is not just about governments. It is about us, about whether we are willing to ask, to demand, to question, about whether we are willing to trade freedom for the illusion of safety. And this story has no end, because as long as nations fear enemies, as long as citizens fear danger, the shadows will grow. But as long as there are voices that dare to question, that dare to reveal, that dare to tell these stories, the shadows are never complete. So remember this. History is not only what is written in books, it is also what is hidden in budgets. The next time you hear of a war, a crisis, a collapse, or a rise, ask yourself not only what happened, but who paid for it in the shadows. Because behind every great event lies another story. A story written not in speeches, but in silence. And it is that silent story, the story of the black budget, that will continue to shape our world long after headlines fade. But there's another layer, even darker than the rest. The black budget does not only hide operations, it hides accountability. It hides responsibility. When a drone strike kills civilians, who is blamed? When a coup destabilizes a region, who takes responsibility? When billions vanish into shell companies tied to defense contractors, who answers for it? The truth is, no one. The black budget erases fingerprints. It turns acts of violence and corruption into faceless events. It gives leaders the power to act without consequence, to strike without leaving a trace. This creates a dangerous paradox. Democracies claim to be transparent, yet they operate vast shadow networks that no citizen can see. Autocracies claim total control, yet they too rely on hidden funding from abroad. In both cases, the black budget creates the illusion of order, while chaos thrives underneath. And chaos always spills over. History shows this clearly. The CIA's funding of rebels in Afghanistan created power vacuums that later fueled extremism. Hidden U.S. operations in Latin America left legacies of poverty and violence. Secret wars in Africa fuel cycles of conflict that last even today. Every hidden action casts a shadow that stretches far beyond its moment. And yet, here is the irony. Many of the people funding these operations do not even know it. Taxpayers, everyday citizens, you and I, contribute unknowingly. A small deduction from a paycheck. A budget bill passed in the night. A vote cast without seeing the fine print. The black budget is not just a tool of governments. It is built on the quiet contributions of millions who never consented. So what happens when people finally realize this? Some grow cynical, believing nothing can be changed. Others grow angry, demanding accountability. And a few, the rare few, dedicate their lives to exposing the truth. Whistleblowers, journalists, activists, people who decide that silence is no longer an option. These voices often pay a price. Careers destroyed, exile, prison, even death. The black budget protects itself viciously, but their voices echo. They remind us that shadows are not invincible. They remind us that even in the darkest room, one small light can reveal everything. And this brings us to the heart of the matter. The black budget is not just about money. It is about power. Power without oversight. Power without consent. Power that exists outside the boundaries of law. This kind of power always tempts leaders. Always. From Rome to the British Empire. From the Soviet Union to modern superpowers. The story is the same. The more power is hidden, the more corrupt it becomes. The black budget is simply the modern version of an ancient truth. Unchecked power always finds its way into the shadows. But history also teaches us something else. Empires that rely too heavily on secrecy always collapse. Rome crumbled when its hidden intrigues consumed it. The Soviet Union fell when its lies could no longer be sustained. And perhaps one day, the empires of today will meet the same fate. The question is not whether the black budget will end. The question is when and at what cost. And so we return to you, the listener. What will you do with this knowledge? Will you ignore it as so many do? Will you dismiss it as conspiracy, too heavy to believe? Or will you let it spark a fire inside you? To question, to research, to demand answers? Because the black budget may be vast. It may be hidden, but it is not untouchable. It survives only because people choose not to look too closely. So look closely, ask the hard questions, demand accountability, because the future is not written in official budgets. The future is written in the shadows. And unless we shine a light there, we may never know who truly governs our world. But to truly understand the scope of the black budget, we must look beyond the borders of one nation. Because secrecy is not an American invention. It is a universal language of power. Russia maintains its own networks of hidden funding, used to influence elections, finance shadow wars, and silence dissidents. China, too, directs vast sums into covert operations, from cyber espionage to building influence across Africa and Asia, much of it invisible to the world. In the Middle East, oil revenues often vanish into secret accounts, fueling proxy wars and expanding power. Even smaller nations, from Latin America to Africa, rely on hidden budgets to maintain control, reward allies, and eliminate rivals. The black budget is not the tool of one country. It is the bloodstream of global power. A silent economy where influence is traded, wars are financed, and futures are decided without the people's consent. And here lies the danger. When every nation hides its true face, trust between nations collapses. Agreements are made in public, but broken in secret. Leaders shake hands on camera, while funding wars behind closed doors. The world becomes a stage, and the black budget writes the script. Yet, as history shows us, no script lasts forever. Every hidden empire eventually comes to light. Every secret account, every covert deal, every shadow war leaves behind a trail. And when the truth finally emerges, it reshapes everything. Nations fall, leaders are disgraced, and people demand justice. The black budget is powerful, yes, but it is also fragile, because secrecy is always temporary. And so we arrive at the true lesson of this story. The black budget is not only about governments. It is about us, about whether we will continue to look away, or whether we will choose to see. about whether we will remain silent or whether we will demand that the shadows be brought into the light. History will not remember how much money was hidden. It will remember whether people cared enough to uncover it. So I leave you with this question. What world do you want to live in? One ruled by visible laws or one ruled by invisible budgets? Think about it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. And if you want more stories that reveal the truths hidden in the shadows, make sure to subscribe to Zimo Voice, because the story does not end here. In fact, it is only just beginning.